Trump does deserve credit for the biggest shift in U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War.
Trump's tariffs on China aren't just bold. They might spark the next global war. Check this video out.
Joining me on the line to discuss all of this is someone more expert than I in these matters, Mike Gallagher. He, of course, a former U.S. representative representing Wisconsin's 8th Congressional District. He is now the head of defense at Palantir. He's the former chairman of the Select Committee on China. Mike, great to see you. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
So let's talk about the tariff regime that President Trump has now placed on the entire world, but mostly China. So he's gone to a 10% baseline rate with pretty much everybody except for Mexico and Canada. And he's gone to a 145% tariff rate on China. Now, I'm obviously very warm towards smacking China as hard as humanly possible. What do you think of the implementation of the policy? What would a smart tariff policy look like? The case that I've made is that strategically, obviously orienting toward China as a geopolitical enemy is correct. But the tactics of how you actually box them in, that matters an awful lot here. What do you think President Trump is doing right? What is he doing wrong?
Well, the first thing, I think President Trump should take credit for the 301 tariff investigation he launched in his first term. And if you read the documents justifying the 301 tariffs, it's actually an incredible piece of work and really lays out in unprecedented fashion in terms of its scope and scale the economic war that China has been waging against America since they acceded to the WTO. And so I think the 301 tariffs on China are justified. I would go further and say, as we endorsed in a bipartisan manner, even Democrats agreed to this on the committee, I think the time has come for us to remove permanent normal trade relations status with China. You can argue that the tariffs effectively have done that already. But if you remember, when we ratified PNTR, we basically said that China's economy is permanently a market economy. Okay, China's economy has never been a market economy at all. And so continuing the 301 tariffs, removing PNTR, and cutting off the flow of outbound capital investments from America to China, at least when it comes to military items, I think is critical because right now we're subsidizing our own destruction, right? Chinese ships, military equipment, American asset managers are subsidizing that. So I think Trump can go hardcore on that. And then at the same time, and this is where the strategy comes in, I do think you need to, I'm less sympathetic to the 232 tariffs. I think you have to, in order to mitigate the economic impact of China tariffs, but also just to rally the world against China's predatory practices, you need to find ways to break down economic and technological barriers within the free world and expand the bounds of the free world to include countries that don't fall neatly into the ally category. For example, even with our closest allies, the UK and the Aussies, we have the AUKUS arrangement. There are still barriers to collaboration because of outdated ITAR regulations that we could get rid of. And Trump could claim, hey, I'm bringing the free world closer together. We are joining hands to push back against the commies who are trying to destroy us right now. That's like the highest level grand strategic move I think he needs to make.
Isn't it wild that we still treat China like a market economy when they clearly operate like a centralized war machine? When Palantir leaders talk about economic warfare, they're not being dramatic. They're diagnosing a slow-motion geopolitical disaster. The U.S. has been playing checkers while China plays Go.
So, Mike, I was talking about this on the show, and one of the things that I've suggested was that if you are preparing for this level of a trade war, which could get into some pretty severe risks of the actual shooting war, and we'll talk about that in a moment, if you're doing a trade war like this, one of the things you have to make sure of is that all your ducks are in a row. And what that means, you have to draw your allies close. You actually have to build these alliances to the point where they don't fracture. You don't have the EU working back channels with China, for example. You have to actually build up our military mechanisms such that if China should decide that it wants to try something, it's dissuaded by deterrence from doing that thing. And you actually have to reshore or allow for the reshoring of crucial industries away from China. All those things take a little bit of time. And so perhaps the idea of a gradual escalation here that sort of boils the frog slowly as opposed to turning the flame all the way up would have been a better idea. Well, what do you make of that?
I agree with that. If you read the final economic report of the Select Committee on China, when we endorsed getting rid of PNTR, we argued for the gradual phasing in of a new tariff regime. There's some things that we care less about. For example, like I want Wisconsin farmers to sell soybeans to China. And quite honestly, I don't have a problem if Americans want to buy cheap textiles from China as long as those textiles aren't made with slave labor in Xinjiang province. But continuing our dependency when it comes to advanced pharmaceutical ingredients, rare earth and critical minerals, all things that we know are going to be weaponized by China if we find ourselves in a confrontation over Taiwan, for example, strikes me as a very bad, strategic misstep. So to me, it's easy to start to revive a kind of bilateral trade agenda. I don't think anyone's arguing for a big multilateral trade agreement, perhaps a digital regional trade agreement in Indo-Pacific. But you could see a post-Brexit gold standard trade agreement with the UK with a docking provision. I've argued for a free trade agreement with Taiwan, provided the standards are high. You could start to build that. The hardest thing with all of this, I think, is how do you actually effectuate the onshoring, right? Because I think the CHIPS Act provides a good example of how not to do this, right? We're not going to fork over $50 billion for every industry we decide is important from a national security perspective. And we certainly aren't going to have a good effect from that if we also saddle those grants with absurd conditions, right? Like in order to get a CHIPS Act grant, you need to build like a woke daycare next to your facility. So there, I think the best mechanism for onshoring is a combination of bilateral trade agreements, technology agreements, and radical deregulation of the domestic economy and leveraging our asymmetric advantage, which is not throwing a ton of humans and money at the problem. It's innovation. It's leveraging software to reimagine manufacturing, things like that. Above everything you said, though, Ben, I want to hammer home the most important variable, the variable that matters more than anything else, is the balance of conventional military power, right? Our economic moves are important. They're non-trivial. But if we don't fix the balance of conventional military power, which is sliding in the wrong direction, the odds of a war with China that will not end well for us go up and up and up.
This might be the most honest assessment you'll hear. If the military balance tips too far, the rest doesn't matter. Economic strategy, alliances, trade, they're all secondary to deterrence. You can't negotiate your way out of weakness, especially with an adversary like China that studies vulnerability like a science. That's why restoring the conventional military balance isn't optional. It's urgent. And it doesn't just come down to hardware like ships and planes anymore. In the modern battlefield, the decisive edge is software, decision dominance, real-time intel, cross-domain coordination. That's where Palantir enters the equation, not as a vendor, but as a strategic force multiplier.
Historically speaking, when countries feel that cordon tightening, it actually does lead to war. I mean, this is presumably what happened with the attack on Pearl Harbor. The historians basically suggest that because the West was working so hard to deprive Japan of rubber and oil, that basically Japan felt that the only way that it could break out was to preemptively strike the United States before the United States actually had time to mobilize its military capacity. So one of the things that becomes very clear here is that as the news tightens around China, which is obviously what the Trump administration would like to do, China could pursue some pretty significant retaliatory measures. And three that come to mind right away that we've been discussing on the show are the deprivation of rare earths minerals. China controls a huge percentage of rare earths minerals, so they could theoretically just stop exporting those. Two would be the mass sell-off of American bonds, try to undermine the American economy by basically killing our debt. And three would be the most extreme measure, which would be a blockade or even invasion of Taiwan. Maybe you can talk about those various risks.
Well, maybe I'll attempt to connect sort of the economic dynamics you started with to the invasion of Taiwan, because traditionally, particularly when people on Wall Street analyze this problem, they say, well, China would never invade Taiwan, right? It would be an economic catastrophe. I think that is a dangerous form of mirror imaging. And I think it actually gets the causality backwards, right? Because they'll say, well, China's economy sucks. Therefore, Xi Jinping wouldn't be foolish enough to invade Taiwan. Well, part of the reason China's economy sucks is because Xi Jinping is actually preparing his country for a war with America and the West over Taiwan, right? He's encouraging his citizens to eat bitterness, to use a phrase he's used to young Chinese citizens, right? And he's trying to sanction-proof his economy. And I think the more we engage in that dangerous form of mirror imaging, the less prepared we are. So how do you deal with it, right? Just to reinforce the fact, you need to develop the ability, not just the threat, but the ability to put the entire PLA Navy on the bottom of the Taiwan Strait if they do something as foolish as trying to take Taiwan. That's point one. Point two, figuring out the onshoring in critical industries. I mentioned APIs earlier. if you remember in the early stages of the pandemic, Chinese officials threatened to cut off the export of pharmaceutical ingredients and plunge us into a sea of coronavirus. And in the wargaming we did on the select committee, we started off in the conventional military domain, but we increasingly realized a lot of this would play out in the economic space. It would become supply chain warfare. And then third, I would say we have to, as of like yesterday, develop the capability to deal with the cyber weapons that China has pre-positioned in our critical infrastructure, right? Imagine someone went around the country like strapping sticks of dynamite to every water utility or grid system around the country. Well, effectively, that's what's happened with the revelations surrounding Bolt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon. That's a huge vulnerability. And one thing that's also apparent if you do any wargaming around Taiwan, the United States homeland is a target for attack, especially in the cyber domain. In a meaningful sense, you can say the invasion of Taiwan has already begun in the cyber domain. And therefore, in order to have an effective deterrent in cyber, we also need to develop the offensive capability to tear down the Great Firewall in China. I've argued that that should take on a position of importance in our grand strategy, similar to the way tearing down the Berlin Wall was a centerpiece of late stage old Cold War strategy.
Why do we keep assuming our adversaries think like us? That's the fatal flaw in mirror imaging. We believe economic pain will deter conflict because it would deter us. But Xi isn't operating from a Wall Street playbook. He's preparing for war, economically, militarily, and psychologically. He's telling his people to embrace hardship, to eat bitterness, because he sees sacrifice as a path to dominance, not a deterrent. So when analysts say China wouldn't invade Taiwan, it would be too costly, they're projecting Western logic onto a regime that's playing by entirely different rules. If we don't build our deterrence with that reality in mind, conventional, cyber, and economic, we're not just miscalculating. We're walking blindfolded into a strategic trap of our own making.
So, Mike, obviously, as we watch all of this play out, I think we both agree that the orientation of the Trump administration is correct right here. I'm asking you to look into a crystal ball, but again, you work at a company called Palantir, so I suppose that's okay. What exactly do you think is going to be the Trump administration's plan going forward? Do you think they stick with this high level of tariffs? Are they able to broker these bilateral agreements, or do you think that the Trump administration will look for some form of off-ramp? Because one of the things that we have to consider here is, President Trump has said that he uses tariffs as leverage. The problem I have is I'm not sure exactly what leverage you could ever receive from China that would be sufficient to make anyone sanguine about going back to anything like a trade normalized relationship. I mean, they're stealing $600 billion a year in our intellectual properties, just as starters.
Well, I do think the Trump administration has an opportunity to go around the world now and cut various deals with countries that they'd threatened to tariff. I think that would be good for Americans. I mean, a lot of the devil will be in the details. The area that my crystal ball or my Palantir seeing stone is most murky is when it comes to the future of our economic relationship with China, right? Because President Trump has signaled time and again that he wants to cut a deal with Xi Jinping, right? In the first term, they had a phase one trade agreement with Xi Jinping, and there were a lot of other priorities that got held up in pursuit of that deal, right? I had an amendment to the defense bill that would have imposed the death penalty on Huawei and ZTE, big Chinese telecommunications companies. That got delayed for a while as they pursued this trade deal. China, of course, like every other agreement they've made internationally since the founding of the party, didn't fulfill the terms of that agreement. They never kept their promises. And so I think it would be unwise to pursue a phase two trade deal, at least until they come into compliance with phase one. And then the catastrophe scenario would be if some trade agreement with China or concession is bound up in a broader geopolitical agreement where we basically surrender a certain amount of our position in the Indo-Pacific. Now, I don't think that's what's going to happen, right? Because I know Mike Waltz, I know John Ratcliffe, I know Pete Hegseth, like these are hawkish folks when it comes to China. I think they see the threat of the CCP clearly. And to sort of end where I began, like Trump does deserve credit for the biggest shift in U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War, right? The entire now bipartisan realignment in a hawkish direction on China was started in 2017 with the first Trump term. Now, the administration was divided on key issues. The division, however, was resolved at the end by what we saw with China's behavior in the pandemic and covering up the origin of the pandemic. If we had any lingering doubts about the genocidal Marxist-Leninists we were dealing with in Beijing, the pandemic sort of removed all of those doubts. So similarly, now is a time to see our enemies clearly, work with our allies and partners to push back on that threat. It's not going to be easy. I think it's more complex than the old Cold War because we were never economically entangled with the Soviet Union. But it is well within our power to not only prevent a hot war, but to win a Cold War against the CCP.
We don't need a crystal ball. We need clarity. And right now, the Trump doctrine is the clearest it's been in years. Decouple, deter, and defend. The real question is whether that clarity holds in round 2. The mistake would be chasing a Phase 2 trade deal when China hasn't honored Phase 1, because every time we've tried diplomacy through dependence, it's cost us leverage, not gained it. If concessions to Beijing are baked into a broader geopolitical compromise, say dialing down our presence in the Indo-Pacific, that's not strategy, that's surrender. What we need is the resolve to finish what started in 2017, a total strategic realignment. And that means rejecting false stability in favor of long-term deterrence, military, economic, and cyber. The post-Cold War playbook is dead. This new game is more complex, more entangled, and winning it starts with seeing our enemies clearly. Palantir exists to help do exactly that.
That's Mike Gallagher. He's the head of defense at Palantir and former chairman of the Select Committee on China. Mike, really appreciate the time and the insight.
Thank you, sir.
Well, that's all for now.